Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to our second day of our Sport and Society Conference. I hope you all had a good night of sleep and you're ready for some more provoking, exciting conversations about sport and society. So we'll get started today with a panel around exploring local sporting cultures, reflecting on the growth of informal sport participation. I'm going to introduce our panelists and I'll ask them to join us here. We're going to do that for about 50 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions from the audience, okay? So I'll start inviting Professor Ruth Jeans. Professor Ruth Jeans is interim dean in the Faculty of Education and head of school curriculum, teaching and inclusive education. Professor Jeans is a sociologist whose research interests focus on the use of sport and active recreation as a community development resource, particularly to address social exclusion amongst acutely marginalized groups. Professor Jean's research has attracted a range of external funding. She's the lead investigator on a recently awarded ARC Discovered Grant, United on the Field, Enhancing Equity and Inclusion in Community Sport. And she's also the lead investigator on a Victorian Health Impact Research Grant, Enhancing the Capacity of Victoria Sport to Tackle Racism, with research team from Monash University, the University of Melbourne, Victoria University, and in partnership with the Centre for Multicultural Sport. I'll now invite our second panelist, Su-Ling Kwek, to join us now here. Su-Ling is the Strategic Innovation Advisor in the Office of the CEO at the Center for Multicultural Youth. She has over 30 years of experience in the not-for-profit and government sectors, where she had oversight for significant public policy development in government, in design and implementation of critical community programs in the community sector. As part of her current role, she provides evidence, planning, and implementation of strategies on community and organizational sustainability. Her approach is to draw on formal and informal research to translate the findings in order to identify trends and opportunities. Research partnerships are key to the work, and through her role in the Center for Multicultural Youth plays a significant role in bridging the research community and the multicultural families and communities. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome to our panel Professor Ramon Spy. Ramon Spy is a professor of sociology at Victoria University in Australia, where he explores how conflicts and inequities that threaten social cohesion can be transformed toward more harmonious community relationships. Professor Spy's research enhances opportunities for social change through sport, creating a sense of belonging for people. He focuses on sports for development, investigating social issues toward equity, diversity, and inclusion in sport. Professor Spy partners with organizations global to local, building relationships to understand key problems practitioners and communities face to develop capacity building resources change makers can deliver with confidence. Professor Spy shapes policy and practice at the international and multinational level. So welcome our panel. I'll hand over now to Dan and we'll get started.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for the introduction. Excuse me. And thank you so much for the invite to be here today. We're all really excited to chat about this project, and thank you all for being here. We're going to talk today. I'm going to give a bit of a presentation, and then we'll have a bit of a panel discussion about a project that we've all been involved with for the last 7 or 8 or so years now in an Australian context, looking at informal sport participation. This project was funded by the Australian Research Council. It was what's called a linkage project and involved engaging with industry partners, of which Sulin and Centre for Multicultural Youth have been a huge and influential partner on this project. But we've also worked with Vic Health as well, Cricket Victoria and the local government for sport and cultural industries in Western Australia. And just to acknowledge as well my other colleagues that aren't here today that have been part of this project. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the peoples of the Kulin Nation today, and acknowledge this is unceded land. And I'd particularly like to pay my respects to the peoples of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, who are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash stands. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Indigenous people joining us in the room. I thought it might be fitting to link First Nations perspectives to this presentation by talking through a quote from First Nations author Ellen van Neerden, who in their powerful book Personal Score discusses sport from an Indigenous perspective and talks about how many First Nations sports are non-competitive, in contrast to European sports that are almost exclusively competitive. First Nations sporting traditions promote wellness and social bonds, whereas European sporting traditions can further social divides. European sport is set up to prey on the othered, whereas First Nations sport is about working with the environment. Non-Indigenous sport is in direct opposition with the environment and sees the environment as part of conquering. And I think this is really sort of important perspective in considering informal sport, and particularly what we'll talk about in relation to resistance and informal sport being a culture of resistance to traditional formats of sport that predominate in Western societies. So just to start with a bit of background to the project, before I go into the background, I think probably one of the first things is just what we're kind of talking about here when we're talking about informal sport. And that in itself is quite a contentious issue that we've really grappled with across the project. We initially, when we started the project, defined informal sport participation as participation in recognised activities, sporting activities, that didn't require a membership or an affiliation to a recognised sporting association. But as we've gone on through this project and as our thinking's developed, and particularly working with my colleague Satoshi's in the audience as working with us as a PhD student, we've really begun to contest and challenge that idea of a dichotomy between formal and informal sport, and come to recognise that informal sport as a space is really blurry. There's a continuum. Informal sport can actually be highly structured and organised, but still be taking place outside of those structured organisations and boundaries. So just to acknowledge that it is contentious, but in the sort of what we talk about in the activities in the presentation, it is quite useful to think of these as happening outside of the club space of sport and the regulated official space of sport. So in regards to the background, within Australia, there's been a real sort of significant shift in the way people participate and engage in sport over the last 15 years. And this has been recognised in numerous CSIRO reports looking at the future of Australian sport and the mega trends, and recognising that people are looking and using new technologies. There's different lifestyle constraints, different ways people want to engage in activity, of which a kind of club-based format of sport doesn't readily sit. This is also a trend that's been recognised in an international context. So a report produced last year looking at EU citizens identified that whilst 38% of EU citizens exercise or play sport once a week, only 12% of those do so in a sporting context. Again, moving back to Australia, if we look at the latest sort of participation data that's compiled by the Australian Sports Commission, we can see that sports clubs are not the main choice for participation in sport for those over 15 years of age. So the latest lot of data suggests that 43% of people participating in sport are doing so in an informal context, and 26% participate in an organised sport. When we look at over 25s, though, that drops to around 10%. So this data and these sort of shifts on the trends is really important when we then consider the sports policy landscape and where we're looking to put resources and support to support sporting participation. Because predominantly that is existing in a club-based space, but if we look at the statistics, most people that are engaging in sport are not doing so in that particular setting. So, increasing participation in community sport is a real priority of sports policy and also at times health policy within Australia and within other European and North American countries. But the investment, as I've just spoken about, the investment resources and policies are heavily skewed towards that club-based sport format. There's been a lot of research over many decades that have called extensively for a widening of the sport policy and participation agendas to recognise alternative formats of sport that go beyond those competitive and club-based format. So there's been a lot within the lifestyle, alternative and informal space that has talked about the need to recognise sports such as skateboarding, surfing, and consider those within sport participation policy. Our own research and that of others has demonstrated that informal sport can provide significant benefit for participation, social connection and mental health benefits, as well as physical health benefits. The informal spaces, as we'll go on to talk about, are often spaces that attract high numbers of culturally and racially marginalised communities. And in Australia and in the UK has been demonstrated as often a preferred form of participation amongst refugee and newly arrived communities as well. And we'll talk more into this from our own research of the importance of informal sport as spaces of cultural belonging. Despite these benefits and the evidence that exists, sports policymakers, whilst acknowledging the changes and shifting patterns of participation, haven't really engaged with informal sport in any sort of serious way and done little to kind of legitimise or recognise it as an important form of sport participation. So whilst we have all these ongoing calls that date back sort of 20 years or so, it hasn't really shifted that investment in the club-based format, which global North countries are highly invested in. Where we have seen investment by sport policymakers in these alternative formats, it's often been to regulate them and control them. So we've seen that very much within the sort of context of skating and parkour, where attempts to engage with these as alternative formats has led to them being co-opted into the existing competitive and structured formats and make them more like traditional models of sport. So within sport policy, there's been a real ignoring of those local sporting cultures that we've seen exist within informal sport and sort of co-opting them in a broader agenda of global understanding of what sport actually is. So just to give a bit of an overview of our project, this ran over 4 years and was multi-layered. So we were working in Victoria and in Western Australia over here. The initial part of the project was a policy analysis and interviews with key stakeholders. We ended up getting a really big data set of around 120 interviews that covered sporting stakeholders across sporting organisations, local government, those involved in sort of community groups and grassroots sport as well. Within our policy analysis, we again analysed over 100 policy documents that shaped sort of the governance of sport participation across different levels of governance, so from the national through to state, through to the local government level. We then, when we moved into phase 2, did a case study analysis across 4 local government areas, 2 in Victoria, 2 in Western Australia. And within these, we went and visited 4 different sites in each council where we knew that informal activity was taking place. And we spent quite a lot of time just hanging out in different parks and different areas, kind of looking at what sporting activity was taking place. And capturing the sort of levels of activity, what people were engaging with and what they were doing. We also conducted, as part of our case studies, focus groups and interviews with informal sport groups, which totaled around 160 participants in total. We also, as part of our sort of generic observations, we conducted a systems observation of play analysis, which allowed us to quantify the levels of physical activity that were taking place through informal sport, which, as I'll talk to you in a minute, was a really important part of quantifying some of the benefits of informal sport to begin to lobby for this to be taken more seriously as a format of sport participation. So I'll share some of the findings, and I'm basically pulling together findings from across the study into this presentation. So they're quite mixed and sort of draw together a number of different publications. So I'll begin talking initially about the understanding of informal sport participation, why it's occurring, how it occurs, and what the benefits are. I'll talk about some of the challenges and constraints and the barriers that informal sport groups experience, and then talk about the policy and practice. Just in terms of our sort of theoretical underpinning of this project, it has been a really interdisciplinary project. So we've traversed a lot of different spaces, from more health promotion work through to spatial geography, through to cultural belonging, through to Foucauldian analyses. And also, more recently, again, through Satoshi's work, drifted into looking at sort of urban planning and informality theory as well. So there's sort of a real mix of theories that have underpinned our thinking in this space. So some of the key findings, looking at the attraction of informal sport, the key one we found was really the flexibility, the ability for people to be able to turn up, play, engage whenever they wanted to. They're not locked in to a sporting club in terms of seasons, training times, competitive schedules. It is this ability to just come together as a group and play as and when they want. We also found a really strong theme coming through the interviews of one of an inclusive space. Informal sport can be adapted to best suit the abilities of those that are participating at that time. So we found that groups were like modifying rules, they were playing in different ways that suited the abilities of the people in the group. Extremely low cost / no cost compared to playing in club-based sport. So there wasn't the associated costs of uniforms, memberships, equipment really was usually kept to a minimum. Sometimes there was cost of facility hire, but it was really low cost compared to playing in club-based sport. And then related to the inclusion theme, a lot of the people that we spoke to within the focus groups talked about the notion of safety, of feeling safe in these groups, feeling connected to the people they were with, and feeling that it was a space of sort of generosity and support. And the quote there from one of the informal sport group leaders really sort of captures that, about that feeling of comfort, autonomy. And again, just returning to my initial point about the informal sport really attracting high numbers of participants from culturally and racially marginalised communities, informal sport really provided a sort of safe setting that many of the people in the focus group talked about they hadn't experienced in a club-based context. So talking through some of the benefits. Now, this is the quantitative analysis we did from the SOPARC observations. This was done by my colleague Justin O'Connor, so I literally know what's on the slide with this in terms of unpacking the methodology. But we have published on it if you want to know more. So we basically observed the amount of physical activity taking place and quantified this into what's called a meta-hour, which is a metabolic equivalent of task hour that allows us to put a dollar figure to the equivalent of that hour of physical activity. So it allowed us to quantify in dollars the amount of health savings that occur through informal sport participation. And you can see there that informal sport generates a significant amount of health savings in a week in comparison to formal sport that was happening at the same time. And we sort of leveraged that up to then indicate, as you can see there, a saving of 3.24 million every 12 months that's generated by informal sport participation, We think this is actually quite a conservative estimate because it doesn't include the mental health benefits that we'll talk about as well, that were generated from participation in informal sport. It's purely about benefits generated by physical activity. There was also considerable social benefits. We undertook a social connection survey with informal sport participants, and that again indicated that in terms of social connection through informal sport, this was at a similar level of those that we've found in studies looking at club-based sport. And we felt this was important because this is another policy lever that's often used to invest in club-based participation, that it produces social connection benefits and is therefore worthy of being invested in from a health perspective. Whereas what we found was that informal sport does exactly the same, and perhaps for communities that aren't able to access those health benefits from structured club-based sport. We also found participants talked a lot about the mental health benefits in the focus groups and interviews, feelings of connection and belonging. And for migrant and refugee communities, informal groups were really important sites of cultural connection and belonging. I'll just see here. Just got one video that sort of speaks to this really, and some of the connections from informal sport participation. So this was one group, Hazari migrant group playing a traditional sport, Sangara.
10 years we play this game in Dandenong now. The original game from my country. I come from Afghanistan 22 years ago.
It's good for our body, our mental health. When we are here, it's like we don't know where we are. We're just thinking about the play.
I believe maybe many people here, they have tension and problem, one problem. They're sad and the family, they not see long time family. They have thinking what's going on and often for the future. This is like a good doctor because they come and they talk each other. I love it, and also my community love it. They know worry and the other things, you know, just thinking about this game.
We have to stop treating kids like productivity machines where they'll be outpaced and outproduced by AI.
So in relation to some of the challenges and barriers that informal groups face, that there wasn't really a group that we spoke with that hadn't had some sort of issue in relation to negotiating their participation. So there was sort of a number of key, what we've kind of termed discursive practices that were taking place that really marginalised informal sport participation and constrained participation. So one of the key ones of this that we found through the policy analysis was really the othering of informal sport within policy. And so you can see here, in the Australian Sports Commission's strategic plan, they explicitly say that their ambition and purpose is to increase participation in organised sport. So obviously instantly separating out this form of sport as not being a focus, not being a priority, not being part of their mission and purpose. I think a lot of the work they're now doing in the participation space is actually shifting away from this, but having those sorts of statements enshrined in policy gives an automatic legitimising of ignoring informal sport, of saying it's not part of a sport policy agenda or considered important from those key stakeholders. We also found, as the quote from the local government manager talks about, this constant sort of questioning of what informal sport was, and the using of this as a technique to say it's not, therefore, our responsibility. So this questioning of, well, is it sport? Is it active recreation? It's blurry, so therefore we see it as active recreation, so it's therefore not our responsibility, which allows it to, again, be pushed to the side and sort of said, OK, well, yeah, okay, that's happening, but this is not something that we focus on because we focus on sport, which we see as club-based competitive sport. So there was some significant ways in which the policies at, particularly at national but also a local level, reduced the legitimacy of informal sport participation, which allowed for a reduction of responsibility. And this was really accepted unquestioningly amongst the policymakers that we spoke to and did interviews with. And it allows informal sport to slip between policy gaps. There was also a ton of legislation that exists at a local government level that constrained informal sport participation. Priority for facility use was given almost exclusively to traditional structured affiliated sporting clubs. So any informal use had to fit around the gaps that they weren't being used by clubs. As you can see from the first quote, we have informal groups saying that they turned up and just played on a soccer pitch, but then the council came away and said, you can't do this, you don't have a booking. They then tried to book, but they were stopped from booking because they don't have public liability insurance, so they're not legally allowed to book that facility. As the group leader said, it's frustrating, we just want to play soccer. When we spoke with the local government officers about how they allocate usage of their facilities, they talked about having a fair and transparent system. Any group wishing to use a facility could submit an EOI to do so. But when we sort of dug a bit deeper into this, to be able to submit an EOI, you had to be affiliated with your state sporting association. So again, instantly stops informal groups being able to book facilities, which has made us sort of think and question a lot about the use of public facilities, how open to the public are facilities for informal sport participation. We also found in this sort of stakeholder interviews a real strong discourse of this notion of informal sport participants as deviant. And there was some really strong and overt racialised discourses that were coming to play in the thinking here. So informal sport was really constructed as a problem to be managed. This works alongside that idea of othering informal sport as to then position the people that engage in informal sport as problematic in the policy context and are seen as a nuisance. People participating in informal sport weren't seen as a valuable resource, even though, as we've indicated, there's numerous economic, social, community benefits of this form of participation. But at that kind of governance and systems level, informal sport was seen as a problem that had to be managed. There was also, as mentioned, it really played into sort of discourses of who was allowed to be in certain spaces, of racial prejudice and of visible differences, as many of the participants were often in white-dominated areas using spaces that were particularly seen to be available for the local white community. Again, this is sort of in contrast to some of the policies that exist at local government level, health and wellbeing policies that were about promoting physical activity participation. And many of the sports also had multicultural participation policies, but this activity was not seen as part of the enactment of those policies. The final sort of challenge and discourse we saw coming through the policy analysis was this idea of informal sport and integration and the politics that surrounded integration. So many of the sporting representatives that we spoke to really saw that informal sport is only valuable if it integrates into the existing system. So you can see that from the first quote. Informal participation needs to pathway into clubs. We need to look at how clubs can connect with informal groups. So this idea of informal sport's great so long as it's a pathway and a sort of part of the sport participation pyramid that pathways into that structure. There was also this notion as well that informal sporting groups weren't contributing to wider notions of integration and how that integration was understood into community and society. We'll talk a bit more in the panel discussion about how informal spaces were important for cultural belonging and connection with culture, as well as important networks and support structures for those who had experienced challenging migratory journeys. But very much the perspective from that sporting stakeholder level was these are people that are not integrating into society. they're keeping in their own groups, and they're not integrating effectively because they're not integrating into the white, Western-dominated forms of sport that we expect them to participate in. These sorts of quotes as well completely ignore the fact the system they're trying to force these participants into has already rejected many of them and marginalised and excluded them. So this constant sort of discourse of these groups need to integrate into our system, not thinking about how we might need to thinking how we need to change and construct our system to support their participation. So just to sort of summarise and bring together some of the key implications from our study, we found that informal sport participation contributes significant economic, health and social benefits to our local communities, but it really needs recognition as a viable, valid sporting format. Really, supporting informal sport requires a rethinking of the sporting system, the structures that support community sport participation. And there's a huge need for opportunities to access local facilities, to open up access at local facilities and re-engage sport participants in the wider benefit. As I mentioned, this is a linkage project, and part of that has actually been working with stakeholders, trying to also look at the issues but solutions. And so we've been working a lot with the local governments that we've been engaging with on thinking about how do they better design and support facility usage and access. So we've got a great example here on the campus of the Informal Sports Zone. If you come down here quite late at night, which sometimes I do getting off the train to get my car, there's a whole group of basketballers using this facility here that just come in and use it and have open access to do so. Things like providing equipment, providing lighting. One of the local authorities that we've been working with has now got sensory lighting that comes on and off as participants use the facility. But just this idea of opening up zones that anyone can come in and use without booking. We also, as I mentioned, this idea of being able to book facilities and who can book facilities. So there's a number of really good systems that already exist. Within tennis, the Book a Court system here allows you to go online and book a tennis court anywhere that you are for a very small amount of money and get access to it. In the UK, there's an app called the Footy Addicts app that allows you to just go on, find an informal football group that's participating near you and join that group for a session at any time. We've also been working with a startup company called Book Sports who are looking at providing that sort of booking flexibility to local government as well. So we've really, with this project, tried to also look very much at the solutions and how we begin to have those sort of transformations of the system. So just to conclude, I think this quote from one of our state government representatives really sums up the issues here and the need for kind of urgent change. The idea that organised sport, as we've seen through the participation data, is only going to appeal to a small margin of the community. And it's really about trying to design a system that is responsible to where people are at. So I'll stop there, and then hopefully we can get into a bit more detail on some of the projects in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ruth, for sharing with us these findings of such an important project. So we are going just to have a small conversation here to unpack some of those ideas a bit further before we open up for questions for the audience. And I'll start with you, Celine. We heard in the presentation the importance of informal sports for multicultural communities. What has been your experience working in the Center for Multicultural Youth? What do you see as driving multicultural young people towards informal sport participation?
Thank you. Is this working? Yes, it is. Thank you, Lucas, and thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel today. Lovely to see everyone, and I presume there's more people online as well. Like to also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we are sitting on, and to acknowledge that this land was never ceded and is Aboriginal land and will always be Aboriginal land. CMY, for those of you who don't know, we are not a sports-specific organization. I think people always get surprised and going, oh, you're not a sports organization. I'm going, no, we're not. We are a potted history. We were set up in the late 80s, early 90s, because at that point, and still till today, but in different forms, the early founders recognized that multicultural young people were not getting into critical support services, and they were falling through the cracks at the rate of knots. So CMY today delivers a whole range of direct service delivery programs to communities and young people, from homelessness, youth crime, family violence, spaces where we know that young people and communities are not getting the help they need. But equally important, one of the things, and this is our leading up to CM Sports in a second, this is the rationale for it. Equally important, our work is about social change. And we can keep catching young people as they fall off the cliff, but it doesn't change mainstream Australia. It doesn't change the way services or supports are delivered. So our equally important arm of the organizations, all the capacity building work that we do, where we develop the knowledge, the skills and the confidence of mainstream services to work effectively with multicultural communities and young people. And we also do, in order to do that, because we want them to be better. So the logic is, hopefully into the future that organizations like ours don't need to exist, that mainstream Australia will be multicultural Australia. CM Sports, from day dot, we realized there are a lot of clubs, if you think about clubland, a lot of clubs were not reaching out to multicultural communities, and a lot of young people who want to join clubs and tried to get in through the door found the door locked. They couldn't find the key to the door. Or they found the key and very quickly ran away because they're going, I don't feel safe and I don't feel welcome, or I'm not like them, so I don't fit in. So we started to deliver a lot of sporting activities, what you would call nowadays, what we call informal sports for young people, and also tried to pathway them into clubs. But young people also said to us, we want choice. We want to be able to play they didn't say informal sports. We want to be able to kick a footy on the ground, but also, we don't want to play competition sports, but other kids do. And so and some young people may flip between the two, and that's great. But I think the key here is choice. CM Sports was formed, Centre for Multicultural Sports was formed about 4 or 5 years ago, where we started to kind of harness all our different kind of capacity building activities with the sports sector to say, we need a one-stop shop for the sports industry to come to us or go to organization like us to get the resources, to get the help, to get the coaching that they need, to get the advice, to get the knowledge that they need to create that kind of effective engagement with multicultural young people and communities, because they themselves were recognizing they were not doing it. Now, as Ruth said, and through the research it just confirms it, formal sports, I keep saying to the clubs and SSAs, if you don't engage well with Multicultural Australia, your clubs are going to die, because we know the trend is that generally, not just multicultural communities, generally people are not joining up to formal sporting activities because people are time poor. If you think of, 2 parents working, children, kids, they're not going to be able to go to training every Wednesday night and play competition on weekends or whatever. So people want the flexibility, as we noticed, much more than ever, and formal sports doesn't give them that flexibility. Young people also need flexibility because they're saying to us more than ever, we need to go to work part-time for those who reach working age. If I can get a part-time job, I can help my family, especially for those who are newly arrived to Australia, to go to a family struggling, as well as going to school or to uni or to tertiary education. So the kind of flexibility for them is critical. But also, as Ruth was talking, I realized I'll give you an example. One example is people talk about informal sports. They don't realize, I think the sporting clubs or sports don't realize that it's not just patchy little groups of people getting together and playing. If I think of the Chinese Association in Victoria, for instance, they've got hundreds of people coming to play badminton on the weekends. And I'm talking hundreds. So for them, it's a big, massive organization to kind of cater to that many people wanting to play badminton. So there's a lot of organization that goes into running these kinds of spaces. Great example in terms of the benefits to it, it's intergenerational, because a lot of sporting clubs kind of go, oh yes, junior sports, senior sports. I'll give you a good example of my family. My stepbrother used to take, right up to the day that his father died, he used to take his dad, especially as his dad was getting old and becoming, was not being physically active. He used to take his father down to the local Chinese Association to play, I call it ping pong, table tennis, to play with table tennis. He could easily have bought a table tennis set and played at home with his dad, but he took his dad down to the local association because on the weekends, there's masses of people there, and there's an opportunity for his dad to connect with his friends, be physically active, but also for his dad, as his dad grew older, was losing his English language. He started to revert back a lot more to his original language, which was Cantonese. So he could speak his language there, he could connect with his friends there. If he had to do that at a local club, he wouldn't have gone to a local club at all, because that's what they couldn't offer him. So the health benefits, the connection, the social connections, and the sense of well-being that it gave his dad was something that local clubs, in that sense, even though they may be fully accessible, it just doesn't give him that. So I think in terms of informal sports, just using the example, I think communities need choice. And informal sports is the growing option, is the growing choice, the preference for a lot of communities, because not just clubs being inaccessible and I still think there is a role for clubs to do a lot more work in creating open doors. And that's the work of CM Sports, is to help them to open the doors a lot more. I think clubs got to recognize and reach out as well to informal spaces and places like these, so that they get a better sense of what community needs. And so if young people want to flip between formal and informal sports, they can do it. At the moment, it's one or the other in lots of ways. But access is not just the only barrier, or the informal sports has got a whole lot more benefits for young people and their families, because they often also play as a family group. So we know, like with the South Sudanese community, we do a lot of work with them. The South Sudanese communities are really interesting because they've got big families. It's not uncommon for families to have 5, 6, 7 siblings. So the siblings say, I can't go down and play in the club because my mum's got to work on the weekend. I've got to look after my siblings. The siblings range from age 5 to 11, 12. So the older siblings are often the one who has responsibility. He's not going to be able to take his siblings down to the local club and play soccer there. So a lot of South Sudanese community families will help organize their own soccer competitions amongst their own communities, because the intergenerational age thing doesn't exist in kind of local clubs. And the responsibilities that young people have in their own communities doesn't allow them to participate in local clubs. Sometimes they can kind of step across, and we often encourage them and support them to do that whenever they need to, because the other big barrier for a lot of communities, of course, is finances. To pay for a pair of soccer boots, the uniform, the fees. If you've got 6, 7 children within a family, you're not going to be able to afford the costs for 6, 7 of them. So again, these are some of the little little and not so little barriers that clubs need to think about, and how they reach out and become much more agile in their how they engage with informal sports, and also more agile in how they engage with multicultural communities. I feel as if I've gone down a rabbit hole, so I'll stop there for a minute.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Celine. I think we'll just pick up on some of the things that you were talking there, particularly around on the connection, on the cultural belonging, the sense of belonging. And I'll ask you now, Ramon, we've also heard about this importance of informal sport as a site of social connection and the role of informal sport with refugee settlement. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? How does informal sport contribute to belonging and to these groups in our society?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very important question that builds nicely on what Ruth and Celine have said. I'll answer that, but I'll just go back to something that you just mentioned around choice. And it connects back to what Ruth said earlier about how, I'm just thinking also how the research and kind of the fieldwork speaks back to us kind of as researchers, and how we conceptualize and think theoretically or sociologically about some of these issues. So when we initially were trying to sort of define informal sport, it was, as you said, it was quite clunky, yeah? So it was in opposition to formal sport, then seeing it more as a continuum or part of a spectrum, or then everything was kind of fuzzy and sort of, okay, it's anything that's not formal sport. I think what I've really learned sort of theoretically for all this, and it goes back to what Celine said about choice, is it has a lot to do with with agency, and particularly around, I think that's what we've landed on and started publishing on, much more around sort of the enhanced agency that particularly communities that are marginalized or face significant barriers in formal sporting context, that they experience, including sense of belonging. And so particularly that in informal sport, they experience being a lot closer to the decisions about their participation. Right, so it's actually have a lot more agency over the terms of what to wear, where, when, and how we play. What rules do we abide by? Who can play? All those things, right? And I think so. That's I think what I've learned a lot over time. We've learned a lot sort of from the research in terms of how we might conceptualize this. In terms of the same goes for me for a sense of belonging and social connection. Because, as Ruth said, so one of the prevailing sort of illusions or hallucinations around this type of participation is that it's sort of it's a form of self-exclusion. In some countries, not so much in Australia, but it's seen as a kind of a type of ghettoization. It's further evidence of the problem of immigration, right? And we don't have to look far to see sort of those kind of discourses. And yet I think so what I've learned personally, and I think what we've learned collectively through this research, that's a very poor way of thinking about the types of belonging, because again, it constructs false binaries, so false dichotomies, and particularly it really misrepresents what belonging and social connection look like. So in reality, if I look at some of the groups, including the video that you showed, the fieldwork that we did with the Hazara men, what they seek to construct and what they experience are sort of hybrid forms of belonging. They are not either or. They are not playing, they are not participating in these informal spaces, in this case Sangarag, so the sort of Hazara tradition of rock throwing sport game, again is contested. But it's this is not in opposition to, for example, their sense of belonging to their local communities, for example, down in this area, right, in the city of Casey, in Dandenong, or to Australian society. These are all multiple. They can coexist. It's just the absence of spaces to experience that sense of belonging to homeland, to diaspora community. It's what these informal spaces kind of can really provide, particularly for newly arrived migrants or refugees. I think we recently wrote a paper where we framed that sort of almost a soft landing. It's that early transitional support where actually government or state kind of provisions systems, structures to navigate can be very daunting, can actually be alienating, or can lead to harm, right? Particularly precarious legal status and having to navigate that. And so sometimes these spaces can actually provide so that early transitional support through the power of informal community networks that are actually, rather than I guess alienating or self-inclusive, can be quite resourceful, creative, and actually build vital community capacity in ways that, for example, CMY and CM Sport try to further support. Yeah, so that's just some of the ways of thinking about it. So away from simplistic, binary notions of belonging or not belonging, it is multi-layered, it is complex, it's fluid, and they often coexist. And just these kind of informal sports spaces are not evidence of a lack of the pursuit of belonging elsewhere. In fact, they tend to go together, hand in hand. And they can actually, so research more generally beyond sport around migration studies shows that they actually enhance each other, right? So some of that trend is transferable, transcends these particular spaces, and enhances also their sense of agency, their sense of belonging in other spaces. For example, for kids in school, or for others kind of in their extended families, or engaging with healthcare systems, for example.
Thank you very much, Ramon. And I think it's very interesting to think about those dimensions, I think, both in terms of complexifying our language when we're talking about informal sports, and the role of agency and some of those power dynamics that shift when we're talking about what happens in this formal sports. And I want to bring that again, that idea of agency and what happens if we add another layer here with gender. And I would like to ask Ruth now, we didn't really mention gender dynamics in your presentation in the context of informal sport. How do you see the dominant gender relations that we see in club-based sport? And I think we are over aware of those inequalities and the ways in which gender plays out in club-based sport. How does that play out in the informal context, Ruth?
Thanks, Lucas. Yeah, we didn't really touch on it that much in the presentation, but it's really because it needs a whole presentation on its own to really unpack the gender dynamics that are occurring in these spaces. So there's definitely gender dynamics happening within the informal sporting space. It's not a sort of inclusion utopia in that sense. And again, I think it's helpful to go back to the notion of binaries and this idea of informal sport good and formal sport bad. That isn't the case. Gender dynamics certainly played out, and in ways similar to the ways that it does in more club-based formats of sport. Also, I think within that, again, there are complexities there. And I think those complexities have been really unpacked a lot in more of the lifestyle sport literature. So the work of Beck here looking at surfing and the gender dynamics that exist there sort of is very relevant to thinking more of the informal sport space here. What we did find, and also what the Ozplay participation data indicates as well, is that women and girls are engaging in informal sport in huge numbers. They're there, but we found this participation is quite heavily mediated in terms of where it occurs. So when we were doing observations within local authorities and in open spaces in parks, it was predominantly men and boys that were engaging in informal sport spaces. We found women's groups to be part of the project, but we had to find them. We couldn't find them just wandering around an open park space. So what we found were women and girls tended to have secured either facilities that were outdoors but were sort of regulated facilities, or they were in indoor spaces and had got access to indoor spaces. So there was whole layers of safety and safety within public spaces that were playing out within the experience of women informal sport participants that weren't as noticeable in the men's accounts of their experiences of playing informally. Whereas the men encountered all this resistance from things like council officers coming and moving them off spaces, of chasing them off, often hostility from the public in terms of what they were doing in public spaces. this by and large didn't deter them from actually being in those spaces, whereas women that had that experience didn't return to those open spaces again. That put them off from being in there. They felt threatened, they felt unsafe. So there's a whole sort of narrative around safety, what are safe spaces, and then again racialised discourses playing into that as well, as to what spaces certain women felt able to access and be in. I think as well we can sort of talk about gender dynamics within the policy analysis side of things. So although it's considerably under threat at the moment, there has been a huge drive by the Victorian government in promoting gender equity within sport, with significant financial investment, and a key policy called the Fair Access Policy, which is all about promoting gender equity access to facilities in sport within Victoria. That policy is almost unilaterally focused on accessing club-based participation for women and girls. The informal setting has been completely ignored as a vital area that women and girls are participating in sport. Again, a total marginalisation of informal participation within that policy context. So there's a number of key gender dynamics that are happening within the informal sport setting. But again, going back to some of the benefits, there were real clear benefits from the women's groups that we did speak to about their value of the informal sport as a setting to participate. And within the space of that setting, finding it a highly inclusive, supportive environment to play sport and to be in a sporting environment that, again, they didn't feel within a club-based context.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And I think let's just get back to you now, Ramona, if you wanted to add anything to that and share a little bit about the role of informal sports in the experience of Afghan women soccer players in Australia, which can be an interesting case study to unpack some of more those ideas that Ruth were talking about.
Yeah, I think what really stood out for me in the group, sort of the Afghan women that we did some of the fieldwork with, sort of, first of all, sort of really resonating with what Ruth had just talked about, but particularly how their experiences both sort of confirmed the barriers that they often experience in relation to sort of club-based sport and often the lack of supportive spaces in more formal sport, but at the same time kind of the resourcefulness and the collective efforts among the women and sort of the significant others in their lives to really build more capacity and create more community assets for them to play in informal sport, and how they tried to navigate that quite cleverly, quite creatively and resourcefully. So yes, there were all these barriers, but I think it was also speaking back to that deficit idea, right? Oh, these girls and women experience all these heightened barriers, particularly as Muslim girls and women, that in reality that was also, again, much more nuanced and, again, much more complex and layered than that. And that actually, yes, they experience those barriers, but at the same time, for example, they would argue that, hey, there is really also a shift in our communities from sort of discouragement of parents, of male siblings, etc., to more support. And what was quite interesting, we sort of tried to trace or better understand their journey sort of for those, some migrated sort of back in the 80s, but some migrated quite recently, particularly after the resurgence or the return to power of the Taliban, right, in Afghanistan, I think 2021. And they talked about how it's not, again, a simple dichotomy as, back in Afghanistan, we had no right to play, right? Which is true. We're banned not just from sport, but also from education and sort of really constrained opportunities, so heavily constrained agency. Yet it wasn't like settlement sort of in Australia was all kind of easy, and yes, they're still confronted some of the same barriers, often less heightened, but they actually sort of noted that, hey, there is a shift in this. And when we sort of discussed their aspirations, what is quite interesting is that often when we talk about the benefits of sport and the health and social benefits, we go down to that level of individual, right? Individual aspirations, or even career, talent identification, pathways. It's about individuals. they often talked about their individual aspirations of developing as players, or also in education, or their contribution to the community life, but very much more collectivist aspirations as well. So actually, how can we create more opportunities for other girls and women to follow? So again, it's challenging that somewhat individualistic or deficit thinking towards actually, hey, here's a group of women trying to build expand community assets and community capacity, particularly in informal sport in the early stages. But how can we also, where possible, have those opportunities also to link that to formal sport? So again, it's not an either or, but it really starts at those informal community networks and can sort of build from there, I guess.
Thank you very much, Ramon. And I think just for us to finish on this part so that we can open up for your questions, I think I wanted to shift a little bit and ask Celine, if we think about the overview that we talked about at the policy level. So we've been talking about how these individuals experienced and creatively navigated those tensions, but at the policy level, challenges and the sidelining of informal policy of sports within policy. Why do you see that this is happening, and what do you think needs to shift for sporting organizations and local government if they want to engage with informal participation in the sports? Ling.
How much time have we got? All right. Ruth and Ramon, help me out here as well. I think let's start small. I think it starts small from raising awareness about what, research like this, the findings of research like this. We need to get it out there so that local councils, local agencies, local sporting clubs, state sporting associations understand the value and the benefits of informal sports, but also how it's in close partnership with how people one choice in their lives, and how we create those pathways into formal sports if that's where young people want to go down the track with. I think one of the key things that came up with what young people were saying, but also in terms of what we hear on a day-to-day level, is finding the space to do it. Facilities is a big one, and I think that's where partnerships come in. Partnerships are critical here. So how do communities and individuals in that sense come to organizations like us to help create the partnerships to allow this to happen? So critical example is one of the things we have at the moment is that we're just about to start a project that looks at working with local councils to create those policies around flexible use of spaces and places. Yeah. The other one, which is a real, for us in CMY, a very untapped gold mine in that sense of facilities, and I don't know how we unlock this because we've tried it in the past, is schools. Schools have amazing facilities. They're not amazing as in, locked up facilities in that sense. How do we open the gates, the school gates, to allow communities like you just give the example here, Monash. You've got people can just walk in and use the basketball court or whatever else. A lot of schools do have basketball courts, for instance, that communities young people come and say to us, I go to this St. John's school down at Casey, and they go, how do I talk to my teacher to help unlock the basketball court after school hours? There's a whole lot of legislations, policies that's in public schools about use of facilities and what can be done, what can't be done. But I think, it sets up some barriers, but I think let's have those conversations again with the Department of Education, for instance, about, rather than a one-to-one level on the ground, how do we work with the Department of Education to unlock those school gates? Partnerships for me, from where I sit in terms of, I don't know what you call us as industry partners with research, is that those partnerships are critical. Whether it's partnerships with local councils, partnerships with government, or partnerships with researchers like yourself, because what Ruth and Ramon has done for Center for Multicultural Sports is, given us the goal in terms of the evidence. Often I would go to government and say, look, anecdotally, this is what we know. Government will say to us, give us the evidence. And we go, I can give you anecdotal evidence, but I don't have hard evidence. So us being able to partner with people like Ruth and Ramon is invaluable. Because then we can take the findings to government and say, here's the hard evidence. How can we work with you to help us unlock some of the gold that's on the ground? Yeah. I don't know. And from where you sit as researchers, because I think there's partnerships. I can't bang on enough about partnerships, because we can't do the work we do without the partnerships. And from your end, I don't know, in terms of from the researchers' end, because partnerships are also hard work. It adds another layer of work on top of doing the research work that you do, and whether from your end of things, how it helps you, if any.
Do we have time? Yeah, Ruth, I don't know what you... No, I think what I would simply say, just from a research perspective, it takes time to build those partnerships. So we're talking about, we're now talking about a 12-year partnership and running. So just that idea, so it takes a lot of time to get to understand each other. When we've worked with other partners, I think Sue Lin and others at CMY and some of our other stakeholders have been absolutely critical for us to learn how to speak the language, for example, that, well, in previous projects, the AFL or Cricket Australia or whatever, their language as well, and I think you've been really important there as a bit of a broker and intermediary. Say, hey, we've got these findings, but how do we pitch this in a way? How do we work with them, and how do we make sure they don't get their backs up and they just say, we don't want to know all this stuff? Because as we say, it challenges, right? It challenges some of sort of the status quo. So I think that's been really important, but it's taken a lot of time and a lot of... So I think the initial projects that we did, so we did an ASC linkage project before this, I think we're still struggling. What are the right questions to ask? And really the whole informal sport questions came sort of towards the end of that project. It's like, okay, hang on, we've got some real blind spots. These are some of the questions we should be... So it's like an ongoing conversation, but it's like 12 years and counting. Yeah. So I think, Ruth, that, and I'm speaking here to the interim dean of the Faculty of Education. No, but because it's very hard. That is... that's a lot of invisible labor kind of that is not generally, it's not often recognized or rewarded within universities, right? Because there's a lot of intangibles before we get some of the tangibles. And so I think that I don't know how you look at it from your perspective. That's something that I struggle sometimes to convey. It's like, hey, it's great, you've got these short-term partnerships, but they can't do this really community-grounded work. It takes a lot of time, the research, and also the knowledge mobilization. We're still working on that. And how do we get the Australian Sports Commission on board and some of the other partners that we now work with? But that was really year 8, I think, that started to really flow a bit more, where we're getting some traction sort of at the national level, really. The first few years, I remember the first kind of workshops that we hosted was all local club people, right? That's where I would start it and get them involved. Yeah, Ruth, I don't know if you want to add to that or whether... Okay. Very, very diplomatic, Ruth.
Okay. No. Thank you very much for that. And I think that's really interesting to think about that, because I think there are some parallels here about informal sport and clubland with universities and research with partners and impact. Like, how do you do all that work that it's invisible, that it's considered informal that universities do not recognize, but they want the tangibles, they want the outputs, they want the impact. So it's interesting to go behind to see about how much work, education, personal investment goes into these partnerships, so that we can actually have findings that are beneficial to the communities that we're working about, not for the university's sake, not for our sakes at research, but for the communities that are at the center of this work that we want to do with sport. And I think that's what I love about this research and findings is how it is centering that community front and center. It's not a universities, it's not about us, and how that becomes more grounded in our institutions. But that is a conversation for a different time. Let's hear from questions from the audience. So do we have any questions that anybody would like to follow up? We just need to make sure that we speak on the mics. We've got someone over there, and we've got someone over here. If we have any questions, we still got a few minutes for that.
Hello, thank you very much for an amazing talk about informal sports. And I'm Masaki from Monash University. I've been working on drowning prevention, and so recently there are lots of informal groups started doing open water, and it's great. But at the same time, like state governments, like or the council, worry about liability, but also injury risk. And drowning is crazy. It's like 9,000 rescue a year. So that said, while we are promoting informal sports, how do we deal with those public liability as well as risk injury that it's not covered by the insurance or not even observed by the coaches? That's my sort of curiosity.
Yeah, it's a huge area and definitely a key tension point. And it's really interesting you talk about swimming, because often one of the sort of conversations we'd have with local government where they were concerned about lighting levels on a soccer pitch being a risk of injury because the lights weren't bright enough so a group couldn't use it. And I was sort of often would say, but for the Bayside councils in WA, you have people going out swimming in informal groups, and that's okay, So what? And I think the ocean element is particularly interesting in relation to regulation of risk, because it actually is a lot less regulated than the spaces that are controlled on land, I think. What we've sort of been trying to work with local government on is this idea of, okay, so if public liability is a necessity, how do we make that flexible, and how do we allow informal groups to access that type of insurance without it being this huge financial burden? And again, there are examples of sports that do this really well. Cycling in Australia has a very cheap membership that casual cyclists can pay for, that gives them insurance across the year. So we do have models of that where we sort of hybridize the risk and regulatory setting, but still keep the kind of informality and the flexibility that kind of keeps everyone happy in that space. And I think it's certainly sort of, I think, one of the key levers, going back to Sulin's question about policy levers, if we can twist that policy lever, we can do it. There's some really good examples in New Zealand as well of sort of overarching sport and physical activity insurances that people can get that cover them for a whole range of activities, again, at quite a low rate as well. But it's definitely like a pain point and a pinch point. And I know Beck and I have been discussing this, and particularly in relation to Beck's research as well in swimming, and sort of saying just how much that governs what's possible. So I think it's a really sort of important area for us to continue to look at. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much for the great discussion. My name's Neil. I'm from The Conversation, and what caught my ear was you said that the Australian Sports Commission's strategic plan only really mentioned organised sport. So I'm interested to know whether you've presented your findings to them and whether you've had any luck, I guess, understanding why that's the case and how it might change.
Yeah, so am I okay taking this again? Yeah, we have, and we've been in a sort of ongoing dialogue, and they are, I think, very much more open now and thinking about this as a sport participation format, and certainly the new participation policies are definitely engaging a lot more in the informal sports space. One of the biggest shifts we've seen that seems tiny is changing how they collect the Ausplay data which previously we couldn't disentangle informal sport participation from club-based sport participation. That has changed in the last couple of years, of which we were able to input into that process and give ideas on that, which allows a much clearer picture of informal sport participation. And it seems a small thing, but that is so significant to anyone wanting to advocate for the importance of informal sport participation, because we have a mass data set now that illustrates it is a significant form of participation that can then begin lobbying. So I feel that they have been really engaged with this space now and are really sort of starting to shift. But again, it's thinking about changing systems that have existed for decades. It's not a sort of quick transformation, and it's also what that then looks like. So I think, and as an organisation, they've also been very open about the tension between what is our purpose, what are we here for, and are we here for informal sport participation. So I think that tension still is ongoing. Thank you.
Can I add a quick one here too? I think the other tension for us as an organisation as well is informal sports has such incredible gems in terms of social connection, sense of belonging and all the intangibles. I think how it's able to do that is because of its total flexibility. I think once we try and drag it down the track of becoming much more and we have to. The insurance, the risk, there's a whole lot of things behind it. But I think the tension is how do we do it in a way that still allows the flexibility and allows the informality and not go down the track of formalizing it too much that it loses that flexibility and informality.
Hello. I had just a question. I really was struck by what you said about safety in terms of the groups and the cultural groups. I just was curious to see, because you mentioned a lot of a sense of belonging and a sense of safety. And to me, in more the formalized communities, that means, hey, I'm not going to, we're protecting liability. There's a physical safety. Whereas it seems like you were talking about psychological safety a lot of times for the migrant communities. So I was curious to see, did these concerns about physical safety come up in the informal sport in the migrant communities that the folks that you interviewed and worked with as much? Or
yeah, it did. And safety, it's all both. What's interesting is one undercutting issue, and I'll name the big elephant in some ways in the room, is a lot of young people tell us, in a lot of communities, and young and not so young people, is that, and the perceived and real incidents of racism that happens in clubs. In public spaces, young people, especially African young people, say, we're gathering to play soccer and the police have come around and told us to break up. So I think there's also kind of a bit of racial profiling that happens when young people gather in public spaces and places. So the sense of safety is compromised in that kind of sense, but also safety, there's also the physical safety because it's not just the police, there's other people coming and go, hey, who are you coming and using our park? And so there's a sense it might break into a physical assault. So especially for young women who there's also I'm really glad you brought up the young women stuff because there's also the gender lens around that young women go, no, we don't feel safe in there. And our communities our families would not allow us to go down to the park to kick the soccer ball because our communities and our families don't feel safe for us. Physical safety, much less the psychological safety that young people feel or don't feel.
I might just add yes, all of that. And I would sort of frame, I'm thinking also about cultural safety, right, in relation to racism. So I'm thinking there particularly, I think one of you talked about sort of that potential tension and navigating sort of the regulation sort of around safety. And so then I think broader question is that's kind of a sort of quite a big debate sort of in cultural studies at the moment, but sort of that relationship between sort of safe space and brave space. So I think, is there still space for creative expression, for a bit of risk taking, for stuff for improv kind of, and how do you ensure that that's not completely squeezed out of it? Because that has a lot to do with the pleasures and the more, embodied emotional experience of the participation that we haven't really talked about. So I think that sort of thinking about, we tend to frame everything through the lens of safety, but sort of there's sort of, how can we sort of reclaim or continue to claim the brave space kind of in that, I think is sort of an interesting extension of that conversation.
And I think you're right, Ramon. How do we reclaim the brave space? The other kind of informal sports for me has different layers. So one is what we all spoke, what this research has found in terms of how do we support clubs to kind of make those links or join the dots in a sense. The other one that's often forgotten about or invisible is cultural community associations, whether it's the Afghani Community Association or the Chinese Association, because they are the ones that can also help create the brave spaces, because they are the ones that can still allow the informality, but they've got the organizational insurance, the organizational planners within that, or people within that who can plan and construct safe spaces for communities to come in and use it informally. So I think in terms of partnerships, we've got to think of community partnerships. It's not just individuals or groups of individuals. It's also community associations, sports, and organizations like mine, which is kind of statewide organization that can help broker those partnerships to create spaces that are not so regulated that you lose the gold, what I called it, but regulated enough for people to come in and choose to use however they choose to use it.